Hello, and welcome to another exciting part in Accounting 2302. We're bringing you another episode with your host, Professor Naragon, and we're going to talk about Chapter 17 that deals with basically department overhead rates and activity-based costing, and a little bit of the analysis to it while we go through it. Alright, so in previous chapters, we've discussed two other cost systems known as job and process cost systems. These themselves are mostly related to this single plant rate wide overhead rate, where we just take either direct labor hours or machine hours and just take a predetermined rate to figure out our overhead. Well, in this chapter, we take on two more methods. One is the department overhead rate, which has two or more rates being applied. And then we have activity-based costing, which has many rates that can be applied. So we're going to reflect on those two while we're going through the production process, and we're going to see how these are different from the plant ride rate that we've already done, and how can we get better? Okay, so starting off, we're going to hit the departmental overhead rate method, and you're going to see this is basically taking our indirect cost. Again, this is all overhead, and we only know the indirect that's actually being allocated to these companies. And we're actually going to use almost like a department-specific overhead rate. So it's going to be split up to the departments. From the departments, they're going to have the rate. So these are known as cost pools. A cost pool is basically when we group everything of that department together, okay, and we treat it as one cost. Then we'll have the cost allocated base. Allocated base is basically determined by which activity we like to do. With departmental, it still is related with direct labor or machine hours. And then we just find our cost. Okay, so that's what the graphic is telling us. And we really want to see what happens. Alright, so we got a nice little formula right here to figure out our departmental overhead rate. We're going to take the total budget department overhead cost and divide it by total amount of departmental allocation base. Okay, so you're going to see this happening because we're actually going to do this through an example. So we're going to use Cartco. Cartco is a nice little fun company. They get to do theme park based parks for customization. They have standard for the regular. They probably did some over at the Grand Texas Parkway, the little park, that speedster go-kart race there in New Caney, Texas. Or they start doing it for Mario Kart, who knows. Maybe Blue Shells is in their future. But we're going to only focus on two departments. Again, if we're looking at a really big company, they have many departments and they're going to use the same concept. Here we just want to show you two to show you how they change. Okay, so we have the machinery department and the assembly line department. They each have a budget of about $4,200,000 for machinery, $600K for assembly. They're allocation based. So here's the budget. So here's our budget right here. And now their allocation base is the machinery is based on machine hours, which seems about right because it takes more machine time to create the stuff. Assembly takes direct labor hours. Again, we have more labor probably related to assembly. So each of these allocation base are going to end up falling under here. And we find out that we have about 70,000 machine hours, that's what MH stands for, and 30,000 direct labor hours. Okay, so you're going about to see what we're going to be doing. But we want to give you a little bit more information going on here. Let me zoom in. Alright, so again, this is the formula we're going to end up using. This is our information right here. And now we basically have two models. One is the standard and one is the custom. And just like standard ones that are basically built on assembly lines, we can produce a little bit more, about 5,000, while custom takes us a little bit longer, so we can only produce 1,000 of those models. We already know the direct material and direct labor costs of each one, as you can see, and this is really what this chapter is based on, is what is the overhead cost? How more accurate can we get? So the department overhead allocation rates using our formula ends up being like this. You basically take the budget and divide it by its machine hours or its allocation hours. All this information has been provided for us, which is awesome. We love that. Always love it when information is to us, because in real life we actually have to find this. But right now we find out that our budget, 4,200,000, divided by that 70,000 machine hours, equals to about $60 per machine hour that's used. The assembly department takes 600,000 budgeted and divide by the 30,000 direct labor hours, and it's $20 per direct labor. Okay, so that gives us something. Furthermore, each department used different amounts of these hours. Okay, now again, in the real world, we'll actually would have to figure out these hours, but we're usually given these. So we find out what the standard needs 10 machine hours per unit and only 5 direct labor hours per unit to do the assembly. So what we're going to do is we take the rate, so our rate right here, and we multiply it by how many hours per unit. So this is $60 times 10 machine hours per unit, gives us that $600. And this is for direct labor, assembly line, takes $20 per direct labor times 5, gives us $100. So our overhead per standard unit is about $700 according to departmental overhead use. We do the same thing with custom. See, 60 times 20 now. So of course they're custom, they should take more machine hours. Should actually take more labor hours too, but it's assembly line. It's very quick and simple. So 60 times 20 gives us 1,200, and then 20 times 5 gives us 100, and we get about 1,300 in our cost, okay, per model. So once we have those, we can plug them in to our little chart that was right here, because now we know how much per unit according to this method. And standard go-karts with 700 now added in, we add our big 3 for that cost of manufacturing, and we find out per unit is $1,450 to make a standard on our cost. So cost of goods sold, cost of manufacturing, it's about $1,450. The custom go-karts cost us about $2,400 under this method. Okay, so that's basically the departmental right there. All we gotta know and look for is the budget divided by the allocated basically hours for the whole department, and then multiply it by how much the units actually use. Okay, per unit. Again, this is per unit, not the overhead. Okay, not the overall department head, but we'll usually stay per unit. Okay, now there is some advantages and disadvantages to the department overhead rates. trying to do it this way? One, the advantage is basically this information is usually always available. It's easy to do, very quick to do. So again, easy to implement. I can easily check a whole department and go, okay, this is how much we budget you. This is how many hours we figure. This is how long it takes. And that's it. It's also consistent with GAAP. So being used with GAAP, we can actually release this information to our investors, and our investors can request this. Now, that could have its drawbacks and it's good, but basically we're allowed to actually release this information for financial documents, and a lot of businesses do tend to do that, just so that we can see what's going on for these different products. It is more accurate of an overhead allocation as compared to our single plant ride. Now, single plant ride would have added everything up, and then we would have times by direct labor or machine hours, and it would have just, be an overall picture. This is getting more specific. Now we can actually see which department's doing best. Right now, we can definitely see custom cost us more, but again, it's custom. It should take a little bit longer. Some disadvantages: the assumptions may not be reasonable, okay, due to different products and differences in volume, complexity, batch size, and etc. Basically, again, we're dealing with a custom. We can't just always assume it's going to take us 20 machine hours and 5. That assumption may not actually be reasonable. It may actually take us longer to do it. It may take us shorter amount of time to do it. So sometimes it does have this effect that it just wants to paint this overall picture for the department and say everything's produced at the same time. So overhead costs may not relate to allocation base chosen for department. Sometimes we pick the wrong allocation base. Machinery, maybe we pick direct labor hours, and it throws everything off because people don't work that much. We don't have enough direct labor as we would machine hours, because that happens. We allocate the wrong base, and it throws off the cost. All products may not use overhead costs in same proportions. Again, that's the same thing as saying we just lump all the products together in that department and say, yeah, you take 20 hours. That may not work, okay? So it does kind of lump sum, just like plant ride. So we have to watch out a little bit of that. And also it can distort product costs as a result of all these other disadvantages. So our cost may actually be higher than what it's supposed to be, maybe lower than what it's supposed to be. These little things kind of distort it just a little bit because, again, it's lump summing it a lot more. Okay? So with this, there was created another method, and this method was trying to be a little bit more specific, as you can see right here at the bottom. So this method was known as activity-based costing, okay, or basically the ABC, okay. Now, I will tell you, going through this a few times, after you go through, it will be as easy as 1, 2, 3. So let's get with ABC, okay. What is it? Okay, first off, activity-based costing is based on activity. And activity is any task, operation, or procedure that is where cost can be incurred. Okay? If all activities of our organization can be linked to the use of any kind of resources, so we can actually start separating it out even more. When we're looking at their cost pools, there are costs that are actually related to a single activity. So they're always related to the same activity. So if we want to look at the cost to move raw materials, it could have a lot of various costs. One, we have to deal with the wages of employees in the receiving department. Then we have to deal with the wages for the people that move the raw materials, and depreciation related to the equipment that moves the raw materials. Used to be all this was lumped up to direct labor, or depreciation was basically factory overhead. So now we can actually lump these up and create a little bit better product here. Okay, wages, indirect labor, but yeah. So overhead can now start to get more and more specific. It also brings in what is known as activity cost drivers. Now these cost drivers can be basically any kind of output activity that this activity does. So it could be direct labor, machine, number of setups, number of batches run, number of checks done, number of products produced, number of customers served, anything that has a measurability output we can put as an activity cost driver. And you're going to see with this, there's a lot, but it makes it more specific to that activity. That's more accurate in the measure. Okay, so just like with department overhead rate, basically it gets separated from the indirect cost in our overhead. It will go to its cost pools, even though we've added a third one here. It will get to its allocation base, basically what we're going to do. And of course we're going to divide the two, and then relate the cost to whatever product. Again, this is going to have more accuracy to it. So a lot more stuff going on. And so we like to usually put this in 4 steps. We love our 4-step programs. Again, it makes life a little bit easier. So we're going to start with identifying. We have to identify our activities and the related overhead costs. 2, assign overhead costs to those cost pools. So we're creating those. Then we get compute our overhead allocation rate. Notice, formula is about the same as department. We take our overhead cost assigned and we divide it by its activity level. Okay? So a lot of the rates are being computed right now. Okay? And then last, we assign the overhead cost to those cost objects, and usually activity levels of activity used. So again, going to our cart code, we're going to now take what we know and we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to put their method now to ABC. So again, first step is identify the activities and related overhead costs for each of the activities identified. Here, they basically separate all the machinery and assembly and made it either indirect labor or factory utilities. Okay, still it's 4,800,000. Same thing up here. If I added both of these together, our budget department overheads, it'll still equal 4,800,000. We're just not using departments anymore. So honestly, it can go to machinery, it can go to assembly. We're not focused on those anymore. We're focused on activities. Okay, so our activities now, we have machine setup, machine repair, factory maintenance, the engineer's salaries, assembly line power, and heating and lighting. So with this, we separated out the first 4 into indirect labor. Okay, and the last 2 are all dealing with utilities. That's it. We're not really identifying which department this is going to. We're defining which activity is costing us the most money right now. Okay, so from right here, we get to create our cost pools. This is our second step. So Cartco has designed 4 cost pools now based on the overall activity. One is all about craftsmanship, one is all about setup, we have design modifications, and plant services. So when we look at this split, you're going to notice that they took these up here, and they basically separated them out to different cost pools based on what they believe on the activity. So craftsmanship got assembly line power of 600,000, so their total pool cost is 600,000. Same thing with design modifications. These engineers are the only ones, so it's 1,200,000. But setup actually gets machine setup and machine repair. So their actual total pool cost is 2 million. While activity cost pool plant services gets factory maintenance and heating lightning to get a grand total of 1 million. Still, our total overhead cost should be 4,800,000. So from step 1 to step 2, we should not have seen any change whatsoever between the overhead cost. In fact, overhead cost is basically going to be the same throughout. So shouldn't see any much changes going on. Okay. So third one is going to compute the overhead rate for each activity pool. So now we have our cost pools. We have craftsmanship, setup, design, plant services. We know the costs related to them by separating out our main activities into their cost pools. And now we're going to take these cost pools and divide it by its activity driver. Here, you see the drivers that we're going to use. Craftsmanship is using direct labor hours, setups using batches, design mods are using number of designs, and plant services is using square feet. So we take our cost from step 2 that we've already figured out, and we're going to divide by the expected activity level. These levels are already measured and they're going to be given to us. So don't worry about actually trying to compute these. They're given to you. And in the real world, we would actually have to figure this out. Okay? A lot of these expected levels are just history based. So again, we have the 30,000 direct labor hours right there. We have 200 batches, 10 designs, and 20,000 square feet. So with that, we divide each one and we get our basically activity overhead cost per these items. So $20 per direct labor hour, 10,000 per batch, 120,000 per design, and $50 per square feet. Okay? So some of these are actually common sense. I would tell you this. To do plant services, since the whole factory gets to use it based on the apartment size, square feet does work. Same thing with design mods. I mean, they're designing more than anything because they're engineers. So you see a lot of the activity drivers are basically based on what's been used the most. What seems common sense. Okay. So number 4, we finally get to assign the overhead cost. Okay. So with activity overhead cost, we're going to look at the products themselves and what it takes to actually do these products. So they're going to be based on the activity volume for each one. And we have it basically with craftsmanship for standard. They take 25,000 direct labor hours. Setup takes about 40 batches, or they can do 40 batches. Design mods, since this is a standard go-kart, there is no new designs, so it's just 0. And plant services, odds on it, we have 12,000 square feet dedicated to standard carts. So we take our activity rate that we figured out here, and step 3, and just basically multiply it by our activity volume. So we'll end up with an overhead allocation of 1,500,000. Okay, so that's our actual department overhead allocation. Again, we're not to a per unit base. Here we have basically Custom has its own set of activity volumes, and the same step is involved. Activity volume times activity rate will equal our overhead allocation. Okay. Once this is done, once we've assigned the overhead cost, we can now calculate overhead cost per unit. To do this, all we have to do is look back at how many units we've produced. So this one actually is all the way up here. Oh. So basically we're again trying to solve this one right here. So here's our units. Standard go-kart had 5,000, custom had 1,000. So we're going to take those and basically take our costs that we've figured out here from departmental, or not, well, basically the activity base for each department or each product, and take it and divide it by the units produced. So standard go-karts, our overhead allocation is 1,500,000 divided by 5,000, should say about 300 per unit. Now, if you add these two up, you should still have 4,800,000. Again, overhead is still going to be the same, okay? But with custom, do the same thing. Take 3,300,000 divide by 1,000, and we should get 3,300. Okay. Now we put them in our charts. Okay. So again, 3,300 is now in. Add them up. And now with ABC, standard go-kart is $1,050 per unit that it cost us. Custom is actually $4,400 in cost per unit. And again, this is completely different than department overhead. As you can see right here, we're actually $400 less in about the standard and about almost $1,000 more related to the custom. This really shows how much the department overhead is thrown off when we just look at the departments. When we look at the actual activities involved, we get the more accurate picture. Okay, so this right here is the most accurate we can get. In fact, this is one of its actual basically advantages, is the more accurate overhead cost allocation out of these three methods that we've done. Okay, it's also have a more effective overhead cost control. I can definitely check out which activity or activity base is costing me the most money. I may need to fix that. Like setup, on the custom alone, setup and design modification is huge. So we may want to fix that. Okay? We may have to cut costs in some of those areas. Never cut corners because it's going to lead to different problems. But they do allow us to become better production and pricing decisions based on these. Now that I know that it cost me about $4,400 to do a custom job, I may be charging a little bit more to make sure I cover my costs. Again, more accurate. This is gap related, and it doesn't even have to stay with overhead. We can deal with this with selling and administrative costs too, which is actually pretty cool to use ABC in all aspects. And it can also help determine more accurate profitability of market segments or particular customers. Again, if I want to focus like the custom customer, I can focus really easily on there and see if it's more profitable now. If I'm only selling them for $5,000 for a custom job, making $600, but I sell my standard for like almost $3,000 and making about $2,000, I may be favoring more of the standard. Okay. Some disadvantages to it though, it is more expensive to implement and maintain. you gotta constantly have someone looking at this stuff, figure out the labor hours, figure out all these activity based, figure out the cost, figure out this. Then you got probably an account that's usually just specifically on ABC costing to make sure everything's running smoothly. Okay. Some product costs still remain unclear due to the difficulty of classification. So now these cost pools, you may actually have some products that just don't fit correctly in these cost pools. So it does make it a little bit tough. And it will end up causing a poor cause and effect relationship. I mean, that does happen, but again, sometimes it's taking the more accuracy over a few disadvantages. Okay? Again, more cost benefit right here. It is more expensive, but will it save us more money and help us out in the long run? That's how we have to think about this. Okay? And it can always lead to, again, uncertain pricing or project acceptance decisions. Again, managers will take whatever they want, but again, this is the most accurate that we can get right now. Okay, so most people will take ABC and just run with it. It helps us out, especially for a large company with tons of projects. We have to know which project is doing the best. We have to know which product is doing the best, so we can properly adjust. Okay, so right here, these are just different examples that we could use. Again, there's a lot of activities and a lot of ways that we can actually use as activity drivers. So this is a good chart just to kind of pause and look over and look at what kind of activity drivers we can use. Okay, and that's going to be it for chapter 17. Okay, again, if you have questions, please put them in the comments below. If you have and want to, you can always email me. I'm perfectly fine with that. But please let me know, and I will tell you this. This has been another exciting chapter of Accounting 2302, dealing with Chapter 17. And your host, Professor Naragon, signing off.